Professor Knapp's current project focuses on U.S. counterterrorism policy in Yemen during the Obama administration. Please welcome Dr. Knapp and James Croft for a discussion.
Thank you, Sean. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to everyone here in person and everyone on Altar, and a special welcome to our friends from the Ethical Culture Society of Westchester who are joining us online. We are happy to have you with us, and I'll make sure to look out for your questions in the Q&A afterwards. Here at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, we organize our programming around a series of monthly themes. And our theme for this month is We Can Learn from the Past to Build for the Future. We also, as far as possible, try to respond when we can to what is happening in the world. And today's special presentation is both relating directly to our theme and addressing one of the most important events currently occurring, the ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia. The invasion of Ukraine is a seismic event in world history, the largest military conflagration in Europe since World War II. It has killed thousands of people and displaced more than 2 million refugees. In addition to the warfare on the ground, which has seen Russia engage in the indiscriminate shelling of civilians and break numerous promised ceasefires, the invasion has provoked full-scale economic warfare. Russia has been hit by unprecedented economic sanctions, the likes of which have rarely been seen in the modern age. What is happening in Ukraine right now? Why has this invasion occurred? What might we learn from previous conflicts which could help us chart a course in response to this one? What is our ethical responsibility here in the United States? What can we do as a community and as individuals to help? These are the broad questions which we will be discussing today. Because these issues are so big and so complex, I'm delighted today to be joined by Professor Krista Knapp of Washington University, who, as you've just heard, is a specialist in the history of crisis and conflict. That means that he is the perfect person to help us learn from the past to build for the future. So please, again, join me in welcoming Dr. Knapp, who came here on very short notice. So we appreciate you for being here today. Now, because the invasion is ongoing and the facts of the ground change every hour, we thought it would be best, instead of Professor Knapp providing a talk, to have a moderated discussion. So I'll be asking Dr. Knapp a series of questions, and then in the post-platform segment, if you choose to stay this morning, you will be able to ask your own questions. So without any more talking from me, I will sit down with Professor Knapp and we will discuss what's happening. Okay. Let's see. Wow, they do work. The system does work. So, Professor Knapp, thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone.
Can you give us a rundown of what is happening in Ukraine up until this point? What's happened there?
Well, I think you described it very well in your opening remarks, so I would like to use our time judiciously. But very quickly, of course, we know that Russia is waging an unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression in Ukraine. Ukraine, for those of you that don't know, is a football-shaped size country about the size of Texas with a population of about 40 to 45 million people. It's not a small European country. As you know, 2.5 weeks ago, Russian military invaded Ukraine on 3 sides from the north, south, and west. And it is waging this war of annihilation and destruction against the people, government, military, and property of Ukraine. It is using primarily artillery and armory forces, and relying heavily on mortars and rockets to bombard urban populations. And about 2/3 of Ukrainians live in the cities. The major cities sort of ring the area of Ukraine from 12 o'clock in the north to 6 o'clock in the south on the Black Sea near Crimea. And most of you, I'm sure, have been following this in the news, and you've seen many maps of Ukraine. But there are about 6 or 8 cities or so, Chernihiv and Kharkiv in the north, Luhansk and Donetsk in the east, Mariupol, Kherson, and Mykolaiv in the south. And Russian troops are moving toward Odessa in the south, just west of Crimea. And of course, they are in the suburbs of Kiev right now as we speak. Just this morning, I learned that the Russians bombarded a NATO training center on the edge. It's not a NATO training center, a military training center on the edge of the Ukrainian-Polish border where NATO members have served to train Ukrainians, but it is not actually a NATO base. But it is right on the border, and clearly Putin is very frustrated. We know as of 2 days ago, missiles started landing in the cities in western Ukraine. More have started landing this morning, so this is not just in the east or the south. This is now the entire country. Russia has committed almost all of the 190,000 troops that it had amassed around the borders that sort of run this ring from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. It only controls one major city at this point, and that's Kherson. And as of this morning, there were protests out on the streets by Ukrainians because the mayors have been removed, and in one small city, a new pro-Russian mayor has been put in place. And in Kherson, the protests are against the following, which is that Putin is going to try the same thing that he did in Donetsk and Luhansk in 2014, which is to have a fake referendum. And with that referendum, supposedly Kherson would want to join Russia. So heavy fighting continues throughout the country. You've mentioned the casualties, the refugees. We think the numbers are going to go much higher than that. The fog of war really prevents us from knowing exactly what the numbers are going to be. So it's obviously a very bad situation. The Zelensky government has done remarkably well, but with the resources that they have. Zelensky has demanded negotiations directly with Putin, saying that only the two of them can solve the problem. And of course, there's the international community's response, which we know has been amazingly impressive. Most of the world's people and governments have rallied behind Ukraine and against Russia. Massive, crippling financial sanctions on Russian banks, capital, reserves, investments, offshore accounts, and gas and oil supplies, as well as trade embargoes, corporate business pullouts, global boycotts, and world condemnation of Putin have isolated him and made Russia a pariah state, something along the lines of Venezuela. The Russian economy is in a major tailspin. Just to give you one example, a ruble today is worth about worth about 1 American penny. When was the last time you used a penny? Russians themselves are cut off from the world and will not be able to access basic amenities of daily life once the stocks run dry. Over 15,000 Russians have been jailed for protesting the war, and Putin has invoked a draconian law making it illegal to speak against what he calls, and I quote, a special military action in Ukraine. The punishment for violating this law is up to 15 years in jail, so enjoy your freedoms. And he has also threatened to nationalize American industries, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, et cetera, that have stopped doing business in Russia, but the infrastructure there remains, and he would want to nationalize that. And so, of course, he has threatened the United States and the West by reminding everyone that he possesses nuclear weapons. So, in short, it's an unjustified, unprovoked, increasingly brutal, and nasty war of aggression against Ukraine.
Thank you for that very full rundown of what's happening. It's definitely uplifting news for a Sunday morning, so we apologize for that. We're not responsible for it. We're just reporting what happened. Obviously, this is a disaster for the people of Ukraine, and neighboring European nations must be feeling very nervous. Why is this such a big deal for us in the United States? We might think it's very far away.
It's a big deal because what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. Right, so it's the old Vegas joke in reverse. So, as you mentioned, it's some of the worst fighting in Europe since the end of World War II. Of course, number for number, there was actually worse killing and property destruction in the Yugoslavian civil wars in the 1990s, and even Russia's leveling of the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, in the late 90s and early 2000s. So we've seen this kind of fighting in recent years, but it's definitely going to get worse. What's different about this attack is that it's the first attack by a sovereign country on another sovereign country in Europe since World War II. And the concern is that it could spread to other countries. There's thinking here that if Putin is successful in carving off part of Ukraine or succeeds in getting all of Ukraine, that he will also move into the country just to Ukraine's west, which is tiny Moldova, particularly because there's a sliver of an area known as, and I know you've all done your geography homework before coming this morning, Transnistria. In Transnistria, there are a number of ethnic Russians, and this is part of Putin's modus operandi, which is to say anywhere there are ethnic Russians, they must be under attack as minorities in the country, and therefore it is the right of the state of Russia to come to their defense, which he uses as his justification for invading these countries. So he might go to Moldova, he might go back to the state of Georgia in the Caucasus, in the southern part of the old Soviet Union. The real concern, of course, is that this would spread into neighboring Eastern Europe, which are NATO countries, or into the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia to the northwest, right there on the North Sea there. And that, of course, could provoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which says that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all, and that there would be a collective defense security trigger mechanism, and NATO would get into a war with Russia. That, of course, could lead to World War III, and who knows where that would lead. So talking about bad news on a Sunday morning, that is certainly not where we want this conflict to go. So this could easily, with the United States being the leader in NATO and U.S. having major bases in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, and having, of course, forces that serve under the NATO banner, we don't want the United States to get pulled in. So many of you are probably either some of you are probably of European descent or are actually European or have friends who have traveled to Europe. You know that many Europeans are very, very nervous about this, East, Central, and Western European. They do not want a third major war on European soil, as it were. So this concerns all of us, I think.
Thank you. You are a specialist in the history of conflict, so can you give us a little bit of a sense of the history of this conflict, why it is occurring? You mentioned actions by Russia in 2014. What has led up to this?
So that's a good question, James, and it's a difficult question. How long would you like to stay? I could talk to you all day on that. It's important to realize here that Ukraine existed, or Kiev, which is the capital of modern-day Ukraine, existed before Russia did. It was the birthplace of Eastern Orthodoxy. Many Ukrainians will tell you that borscht is Ukrainian, not Russian, that vodka is Ukrainian, not Russian. Don't drink Stoli. Russian vodka is terrible. Who wants to drink strained potatoes? That many of the traditions in Russia really are Ukrainian initially, but of course going back 1,000 years, these peoples, these lands, these cultures, traditions, norms, food practices, customs, ways of religious observance, they've been interlocked over the years. But Russia has been the dominant power, right? And so what are the reasons for this invasion? Well, nobody knows for sure exactly what's in Putin's mind. But what we can tell you is that Putin's perception of Russian security is really what's at stake here. Russia's official reason for the invasion, of course, we've all read about or heard about. It is that Russia is defending itself from a neo-Nazi-led Ukrainian government that was attacking the Russian people and Russia proper, and that it is the Ukrainian government that is engaged in a genocide against ethnic Russians living in eastern Ukraine. But nobody outside of the Kremlin believes this nonsense. There are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. There's no genocide taking place by Ukrainians against ethnic Russians. This is, of course, classic Russian disinformation. Putin is a master at using Western vocabulary and concepts, things that we've all been concerned about since World War II, and especially in recent years, using phrases like genocide, which he knows are emotional push-button issues, to get at us, to make us think, oh, there's something really bad going on here. In fact, the reverse, something bad is going on here, but the reverse is true. Russia is actually the aggressor here and really has been waging a low-level war in Ukraine since 2014, after his hand-picked Ukrainian president failed to win an election, wanted to be in power, was forced out of the revolutions of Maidan in 2014. That's the main square in Kiev in Ukraine, and for 8 years has been waging this low-level war, using Russian Special Operations Forces to back Russian separatists living in the eastern sections of Ukraine, known as the Donbass. And essentially, this war has been going on for 8 years, and 14,000 people have been killed. That's no small number. The problem, however, is that creating what we in the business call a frozen conflict, which is to say, if Putin can sort of freeze the situation in Ukraine, then he can prevent Ukraine from joining the West. And what he has a number of concerns here. One of them is that Ukraine would become a democracy, which is why he's pushed back against not one but two revolutions in Ukraine, which were bottom-up, people-driven democratic revolutions, the Orange Revolution in 2014, and as I mentioned, the Maidan Revolution, 2004, and the Maidan Revolution in 2014. He's also pushed back against other so-called color revolutions in the region, in Kazakhstan, in Georgia, and other countries. He's terribly afraid of the encroaching democracy that is coming his direction, that one day it will come for Russia and Putin, and that will be the end of him and his regime. And indeed, there has been a white revolution, as they call it, in Russia, but Russia is able to put it down. He's also concerned about Ukraine not just becoming democratic, but joining Western Europe in two senses. One, economically, by joining the European Economic Union, and two, by joining the defensive military pact we all know as NATO. And this would be sort of be the triptych or the trifecta for Ukraine. If it could become a full-fledged democracy and join the West through EU and NATO, this would be lights out for Putin. Why is Ukraine so important for Putin? It acts as a buffer state between Russia and Eastern Europe. As I said, Putin is very much concerned about Russian security. Going back all the way to Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, Russian strongmen have always, first and foremost, been concerned about their security. And the reason for this, if you look at a map of Russia, you'll see there aren't any natural boundaries for where the territory of Russia should stop in the west and in the south. You could invoke the Black Sea or the Caspian Sea east of that. But to the west, it is not at all clear where Europe starts or stops and where Russia begins. Is Russia part of Europe? It's a perennial debate. So as a 19th century Russian diplomat once said, "We like to conquer, but the problem is we don't know when to stop because we don't know where our borders end." And so Putin and strongmen for 500 years have seen Russia as holding up a civilization in the Eurasian area of the world between Europe and Asia. And it is their duty, strongmen like Putin and others before him believe, to maintain that this so-called civilization continues to exist, and it acts as a bulwark against an encroaching Asian threat from the east, and Russia has been invaded by Mongols going back some centuries, and traditional liberal Western values from the West. And it is up to this sort of orthodox position, this Christian orthodoxy that he holds, to defend against these two external threats. So there's a near paranoia concern about security inside the Kremlin. So since 2014, he's been trying to freeze Ukraine so the West could not come in. But it hasn't worked, right? Just 2 years ago, they elected the Zelensky government by over 70%. Almost all the provinces voted for him. By all accounts, he's very popular. And Ukraine, and its people in particular, have continued to drift toward the West. Even if Ukraine was and remains corrupt and weak and inefficient as a state, and we shouldn't overlook that here, but and thus was nowhere near meeting the benchmarks to being able to join either the EU or NATO, its people, its elected leaders have very much politically, culturally, socially, individually been moving toward the West. And this has really concerned Putin. And I think what finally happened is he just decided it's now or never. If we, meaning the Russians, don't stop the Ukrainians from going to the West, we won't be able to, and it'll be a lost cause. And we will lose that buffer between Russia proper and Eastern Europe, and that will become a threat to us.
Thank you. That's an incredibly full response. I'm going to move ahead in our questions a little bit and tackle something that our members who might have heard from different quarters, because you've painted a very clear picture of Russia and Putin in particular as the aggressor and as waging an illegitimate war in Ukraine. Some voices, particularly on the American left, paint a different picture, pointing to things like NATO expansion into Eastern Europe as the ultimate cause of this, and saying that the United States and Europe bear a significant amount of responsibility for provoking Russia or making it legitimately fearful for its own security. Do you have thoughts on that narrative?
I do. I'm not a fan of the argument that NATO is responsible for this. I think that's an old canard that we have to be careful about. Let me sort of find my notes here on that.
Sorry, I skipped around.
That's fine. We planned this very quickly.
When I'm moving around the questions in order to follow the thread, sometimes I make it difficult for my discussion partner, so that's entirely my fault.
We'll wing it. So
I trust you, I trust you.
So listen, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is a defensive military alliance. Its purpose is to defend liberal democracies in the North Atlantic region, which is Europe, Canada, the United States, and other countries. There are 30 members. It is a defensive alliance. Its job, it has enlarged over the years. There have been 4 or 5 major enlargements where since the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, it has added members. So initially formed to hold off the Soviet Union in the Cold War. The question after the Cold War is, when's NATO? Why does NATO still exist? And I've just given you the answer, right, to defend liberal democracies. So it has enlarged over the years, and I think it's done a very good job. The concern, however, is that if you're Putin and you're sitting in the Kremlin, that enlargement looks like encroachment. And these two words may seem like synonyms, but in fact, they're not. And many times American commentators actually get this wrong. NATO is an open organization. Any state that can meet the benchmarks so that it will be an addition to collective security in Europe may join NATO. States that cannot meet those benchmarks and therefore would be a collective drain on security in Europe cannot join NATO. Ukraine was nowhere near being able to join NATO. It would be a collective drain. So the idea is to protect the liberal democracies and thus promote the spread of democracies around the globe. This is a good thing. If you know anything about the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who gave us democratic peace theory, the basic idea here is that democracies don't go to war with one another. Every once in a while you can find an exception to that, but basically the rule has proven true. And so if you want to help make the world a peaceful place, you want to promote democracy. But democracies need to be protected from authoritarian regimes. That's what NATO does. So NATO has added many countries through the enlargement process over the years. But Putin sees this as encroachment because the countries that have been added to NATO get closer and closer to Russia, right? So again, I come back to my main theme that the concern here, or Putin's concern, is the perception of Russian security. Is an enlarged NATO encroaching on Russian security? But as I said, every country has the right and the freedom to join NATO or to not join NATO. In fact, the great irony here is that right after the Cold War in the 1990s, during the Clinton and Yeltsin administrations, Russia was actually put on a path to join NATO. And the idea was, let's also bring democracy to Russia. Russia can join Europe, and Russia can participate in the collective defense of the region. And it was starting to meet some of those benchmarks until 1997, when the financial crisis occurred, and the bottom of the Russian economy dropped out, and Yeltsin went from being sort of popular to incredibly unpopular, and that's when Putin came in 1999. So he has since then seen enlargement as encroachment.
Thank you. That was very clear. I want to bring our discussion towards our responsibility in the United States and what we can do to help as individuals. So can you tell us a little bit, what has the US itself done in response to this invasion so far? And what do you think it should be doing? What are the limits on our capabilities, and what should the US be doing that it isn't doing right now?
So that's a great question. So we have done a lot. I mentioned the sanctions, and the Biden administration's primary response so far has been economic. Essentially what we've done, and I hesitate to use a phrase like this because of the emotional import of it, but essentially what we have done is dropped an economic bomb on Russia. These are not normal everyday sanctions like we used on Iran or Venezuela or Syria or other pariah states like that. These are major economy exploding sanctions. There is no escape from this. The Russian economy is in major free fall. There's a second part to these sanctions that haven't been discussed as much, but I feel that it's important for us to touch on here. The Biden administration isn't just using sanctions right now to punish Russia, and it's important to realize that sanctions don't deter. So the argument here was not to deter Russia from invading, but to punish them for invading, to make the price so high that they would either stop or, while partly through, realize they couldn't win and give up and negotiate for a settlement. We're still hoping for that. So the short-term immediate impact of these sanctions you've heard about on the financial side, but there's another side to these sanctions, which is long-term. So any piece of intellectual property that is governed by US patent law will not get into Russia in the next 20 years. Think about all of the technology for what's coming down the road: nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, hardcore biotech, large computing, big science, the Internet of Things, right? So the world that we're going to be living in 5, 10, 15, 20 years that we're already transitioning into will leave the 2.0 world behind and make the iPhone 12 or whatever we're on now look like child's play. Russia will not make that jump because none of that technology will be allowed to get into Russia. This is one of the reasons why the United States was actually able to win the Cold War, because in the 1980s, a similar technological jump occurred. The United States and the West jumped to digital. Do you remember those days when you gave up your records and you went to CDs? Some of you are old enough. You remember what a CD is? Excuse me. So the Russian military and economy, though, was still working on analog, right? The old records and cassette tapes and so forth. So they just could not keep up technologically. They're going to have the same problem in the next generation. So these sanctions are meant to punish now, to get Russia to think about what it can do differently and stop fighting, but they're also meant to let Putin know that his already shrinking country, and you should know that Russia actually is a declining power, that it is still powerful, but it is a declining power. It will accelerate downward faster because of these sanctions over the long run, and they will just not have the kinds of technology that we're going to have, and that is going to be a major problem for them in the long run.
Thank you. So I'm aware that we started a little late and we've run a little long, so I'm just going to end with this last question. What can our members here, people in St. Louis, the friends in Westchester who are joining us, and any other ethical societies around the country who've joined us for this, what can we do as individuals to help the people of Ukraine, to pressure our representatives to do something? What would you suggest we do? Is there anything we can do?
Well, I'm a historian. We're very good at predicting the past. Predicting the future is a little bit more difficult. I mean, I think every individual has to follow his or her conscience. We heard some great opening remarks this morning about what you can do to reduce your individual carbon footprint. I think those were very practical suggestions. I'm an academic. We think in abstract terms. As you can tell, we like to analyze things from a distance. So we don't spend a lot of time thinking so much about how we can fix the world, but how much we can understand it. But individually, I would say to you, obviously you can make donations to reputable organizations to send money to help Ukrainians. It's my understanding that sending material goods like clothes or that sort of stuff is not recommended because it's so difficult to get that material to them, and they already have organizations on the ground. I think if we have the resources and we're very serious in our commitment to wanting to help, some people might want to think about taking in refugees or the children of refugees whose parents didn't survive. There are organizations here in St. Louis that took in Afghanis from Afghanistan just last year. St. Louis has done a good job 20 years ago taking in Bosnians. Most refugees or immigrants that come to this country do pretty well if given an opportunity. I think that's one of the great things about the United States is that we still do that very well, and it's why so many people still want to come here despite all of our problems and difficulties. So I think if we can create the kinds of structures locally or give to the organizations locally that have the infrastructure to help refugees, and that hopefully one day might be some Ukrainians, those who wouldn't go to Eastern and Western Europe, that we could sponsor some of them, help pay for their schooling for their kids, if they can come here, maybe even take some into our own home. What I think we should definitely not be doing is going to Ukraine. There are reportedly over 4,000 ex-US military officers that are going to Ukraine to fight. Yeah, including special operations forces, for a total of 16 to 20,000 fighters from all different countries. These are ex-military. These are not mercenaries. They're not going to get paid. They're doing this because they think it's the right thing to do. I understand that. I understand what soldiers do. They fight. I'm a big supporter of the military. But I think Americans going to fight in Ukraine is a gigantic mistake. Imagine what happens if one of them gets captured. They could completely draw America into this war, and we would get to that scenario I said before that could lead to a wider war in Europe or America being drawn in, and that is not the way to go. None of them can support themselves. Where are they going to get their ammo, have their medical support, their transportation, their communications? I dare say most of them don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. How are they going to move around? It's sub-zero temperatures or sub-freezing temperatures. You know, I just think, I understand that people want to go and help in any way that they can. But the Ukrainians are good fighters, they're well trained. The best thing we can do, I think, is to give them lots of weapons on the ground, no NATO, no fly zone. That would be a mistake, that would draw us into the conflict, and let the Ukrainians handle this and twist Putin's arm as long as possible until he cries uncle and we get a negotiated settlement.
Thank you so much, Professor Knapp. You said that historians are supposed to help us understand, and you've certainly done an amazing job of helping us understand the conflict. Please stick around if you'd like to ask your own questions after we end the platform. But for now, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I'll be back for questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
In a moment, there we go. All right, collections and announcements, the fun part. If you are moved to make